Chaotic Ambitions. Part 1. Prologue. Tires squealed as a sleek, silver Jaguar shot out onto the highway. An unsuspecting car cruising along slammed on its brakes just in time to avoid a wreck with the Jag. The four brothers sitting in the Jaguar didn't give a damn about the commotion they were causing. This wasn't unusual. They continued speeding along, trying to outrun the demons chasing them as they flew down the highway, hitting over 100 miles an hour, and continuing on faster and faster. It wasn't quick enough. They kept on going until they hit the edge of town in Bay Harbor, Washington, where they found a dilapidated bar with a blinking neon sign that had some of the letters burned out. Cooper, who was driving, jerked the steering wheel and came to an abrupt halt outside the rundown building. "Good enough," he said, his fists clenched with the urge to hit something, or better yet, someone. "Yep," his brother replied from the back seat. Getting out of the car, they made their way to the entrance, an undeniable swagger. In their gait, a swagger that made people turn and watch them wherever they went. Though young, the Armstrong brothers already had a reputation in their small community for stirring up trouble. When they entered a room, patrons would turn away, glancing back at them with a wary eye. The brothers were the first in for a fight, and the last ones standing. They were wealthy, and not above flashing their fat wallets, Rolex watches, and extravagant cars. They were also arrogant and hot-tempered, a foursome to both be leery of and look at with awe. Cooper was the oldest at 24. Each of his brothers 1 year, almost to the date, behind him. Nick at 23, Maverick at 22, and Ace, the baby, at 21. On this night, though, they were looking for more than just the usual trouble. They were out for blood. But the demon chasing them was relentless. And no matter how fast they moved, this was something they couldn't outrun. Their father was dying. Maybe it was the feeling of helplessness, or maybe for once it was not being the strongest ones in a room. Whatever it was, Cooper, Nick, Maverick, and Ace were scared. And because they wouldn't admit that, they were trouble to anyone in their path. This band of brothers had always been revered as much as they'd been feared. They were tall, lean, and had distinct green eyes that hid their innermost thoughts, but shone with a sparkle that most couldn't resist. Walking indoors, Cooper sighed in anticipation. Smoke filled the air as loud music echoed off the walls. A few heads turned in their direction, and Cooper scoped them out, looking for a potential boxing partner. The nervous energy rising off him in waves needed an outlet. So the first person that gave him the slightest reason would feel the wrath of his heartbreak, denial, and feeling of helplessness. As if the patrons knew this group was up to no good, they cast their eyes downward, particularly annoying Cooper in their weakness to accept the challenge radiating off his entire body. The boys ordered beers, then leaned against the bar, facing out as they scanned the crowd. None of them spoke for several moments, each lost in thought. Cooper was thinking they might just have to give up on this place and find a new location when his gaze captured the angry look of a man shooting pool. Cooper smirked at the guy and practically saw steam rise from the man's ears. The stranger began making his way toward them. Cooper's fists clenched with the need to punch. "You're the Armstrong boys, right?" The man was swaying as he stepped closer to them, his glazed-over eyes narrowed. Cooper stood at full attention. This just might be the huckleberry he'd been in search of. "Yep," Coop said, not altering his stance at all. "I hear your daddy's on his deathbed." The man said the cold words with glee. Maybe the man was too drunk to know exactly what he was doing. But instantly the four brothers stepped a bit closer to one another, their knuckles cracking, their collective breath hissing out. "Maybe you shouldn't listen to gossip," Maverick said in a low growl. "Oh, I don't think it's gossip. You see, your daddy has run over many real workingmen to get to the top of that mountain he's built for himself. And now he's getting the early death he deserves." Nick instantly stepped away from the bar, but Cooper shot his hand out and stopped him. "He was looking at me, Nick," he said, his tone deathly low. His brothers shot him a look, but then they stepped back, letting Cooper deal with his demons and the drunken bastard before them at the same time. "Dave, come on. You've had too much to drink," a woman said, placing her hand on his arm. "Get the hell off of me. I know what I'm doing," Dave snarled at the woman, pushing her away. Cooper's fingers twitched in anticipation. He wanted to deck this asshole even more now. It was okay to fight with a man, But to push a lady around was never acceptable. Maybe you should lay off the lady, Maverick said. He wanted to push forward and take Cooper's place. Cooper looked at him and Maverick stepped back, though it was costing him to do so. Maybe you should keep your damn mouth shut, Dave said to Mav. This is Cooper's fight, Nick reminded Maverick. When he began to shake with the need to hit this piece of scum, Dave turned away from Maverick, his beady eyes focused again on Cooper. Are you just like your daddy, boy? Do you like living off the men busting their asses for your family? In those crap factories? At least our daddy provides trash like you a job, Cooper said. Not that you would know. You haven't worked a damn day in your life, Dave snapped. Nope. And I have a hell of a lot more than you, don't I? Cooper taunted him, making sure the man could see the gold Rolex he was sporting. The man spit as he tried to get words out. He was furious when Cooper pulled out his wallet and slapped a $100 bill on the bar and told the waitress to take care of the man's tab, since he probably couldn't. Dave's face turned beet red with fury and embarrassment. I don't need the likes of you taking care of anything for me, he finally managed to sputter. Finishing his beer in a long swallow, Cooper took his time before putting the glass down on the counter. The bar was strangely quiet as the patrons watched this scene unfold before them. So you're one of those guys who blames his lot in life on the big man in the top office, instead of doing a day's hard work, huh? Cooper said, a taunting smile on his lips. I like my damn life. I don't need some rich kid who doesn't know what work is telling me he's better than me. The man blustered. I am better than you, Coop told him with a wink he was sure would enrage the man. Just to add fuel to the fire, he pulled out a wad of cash and threw it at the man's feet. Here's some spending money for you. Obviously you need the cash more than I do since I have a mountain of it back home. I'm going to enjoy kicking your ass, boy, Dave said, tossing his beer bottle behind him in his rage. Though he did look down at the cash longingly, Cooper would have laughed if he had been capable of it at that moment. His brothers didn't even flinch at the hundreds lying on the filthy floor. Money that would be swallowed up the second the boys stepped away. I'd like to see you try, Cooper said with just enough of a mocking glow to his eyes to really infuriate the man. Follow me. His muscles were coiled, and he was more than ready. He headed toward the door. He could do it in the bar or flatten this guy outside. Either way was good with him. You gonna leave the convoy behind? Or do you need your brothers to save your ass? The man taunted. The fact that this piece of garbage was questioning his honor infuriated Cooper even more. He took a second before answering, not even turning around to face the drunkard. You obviously don't know me at all if you think I need any help kicking your flabby ass, Cooper told him. Chicken ass, he then mumbled, knowing it would push this piece of trash over the limit. The air stirred against his ears, alerting Cooper of the attack coming toward him. They'd barely made it out the front doors before the man swung, thinking that because Cooper was ahead of him, he would get a cheap shot from behind. He wasn't counting on Cooper's rage or his soberness. Spinning around, Coop threw all his weight behind a punishing blow that made brutal contact with the drunk's face. The resounding crack of Coop's knuckles breaking the man's nose echoed across the parking lot. The man spit blood as he tried to get up before falling back to the ground. Cooper didn't give him a chance. In half a heartbeat, he was on the ground, slugging the man again and again. Should we stop this? Maverick asked, leaning against the outside wall of the bar, as patrons poured out to watch the fistfight. Not a chance. Hell, I'm hoping someone else mouths off so I can get a punch or two thrown in. Nick mumbled, looking around. It's my turn next, Ace grumbled. Maverick held his brother back. You'll get your turn, Maverick promised him. No one was paying the least attention to the other brothers as the fight in front of them continued on the ground, and Dave got in a good punch to Cooper's face. Within a couple minutes, though, the fight was over. Dave was knocked out on the ground, and with the show over, the patrons of the bar lost interest and went back inside to their cold beer and stale peanuts. The brothers watched as Cooper slowly stood while spitting out a stream of saliva and touching his swollen lip. A couple of men picked up Dave and quietly hauled him away. The brothers didn't even bother watching them go. Should we go back in? Maverick asked. Yeah, I'm done with this trash. Maybe there's another idiot inside looking for a reason to get a nose job, Cooper said. Before Nick or Ace could respond, Nick's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and sighed. It rang twice more before he answered. He was silent for a moment as the caller spoke. Then he nodded, though the person couldn't see him. Yes, Mom. We'll be there. He hung up. We have to go back home, Nick told them. Even without the call, Nick was always the voice of reason. I'm not ready to go back there, Ace said, his eyes downcast. I can't, Cooper admitted. He couldn't allow the adrenaline high to stop, because then, he might actually feel real pain instead of anger. It's time, Nick said again. They didn't want to listen, but they knew their brother was right. It was like a parade down the Green Mile. As they moved back to the car and piled in, they drove much more slowly toward home than they'd driven away from it, taking their time, none of them speaking. When they pulled up in front of the large mansion they'd grown up in, they remained in the Jag, none of them wanting to be the first to open their car door. Finally, though, Nick got out, and the others followed. Their passage into the mansion was quiet, their shoulders hunched. Where have you been? They stopped in the foyer, as their Uncle Sherman busted down the stairs glaring at them. The urgency in his voice had them terrified. They knew time was running out. We had to blow off some steam, Maverick said, his hands tucked into his pockets as he rocked back and forth on his heels. Your father's been asking for you, Sherman scolded. And there isn't much time left. Your mother will need all of you. We're sorry, Cooper said. The others seemed incapable of speech, and just nodded their apologies. Sherman sighed, not one to stay angry for long. They followed their uncle up the stairs. None of them wanted to walk through that bedroom door. But they did it. Their father, who had once been so strong, was frail and weak now, the cancer taking everything from him, leaving him a shadow of the man he'd always been. Come here, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Slowly, the four boys surrounded the bed, facing the man they would soon lose. Time is running out, so I can't mince words, their father started. Dad. Cooper tried to interrupt, but his mother put her hand on his arm. Let him speak, son. Her voice was so sad that the boys turned to look at her for a moment, their shoulders stiffening before they turned back to their father and waited. I've done wrong by all of you, he told them, disappointment on his face. He looked extra long at the blood on Cooper's eye and sadly shook his head. All of you. No, you haven't, Dad, Maverick insisted. Yes, I have. You're men now, but you have no plans for the future. I wanted to give you the world, but you've only learned how to take because you haven't learned how to earn anything. I know you'll grow into fine men. I have no doubt about it. But please don't hate me when I'm gone, he said before he began coughing. We would never hate you, Dad, Nick quickly said. You might for a while, their father told them. But someday you will thank me. I'm doing what I've done because I love you. What are you saying? Ace asked. You'll know soon, son, their father said. Dad, Maverick began, but their father shut his eyes. Cooper willed himself to say something, anything to break this awful silence. But he just stood there, anger, sadness, fear flowing through him. And then it was too late. Not a sound could be heard in the room when their father stopped breathing. For the last time in each of their lives, the boys shed a tear as they looked down at their deceased father. Then Cooper turned and walked out. He didn't stop at the front door. He didn't stop at the end of the driveway. He kept moving, faster and faster, until he was in a full-blown sprint with his gut and sides burning. He tried to outrun the fact that he was a disappointment, that he'd failed his father. What if the man was right? What if he never became half the man his father was? He ran faster. Still, he wasn't able to outrun his father's last words of disappointment. And for my boys, I leave each of you, Cooper, Nick, Maverick, and Ace, a quarter of my assets, but there is a stipulation. It had only been a day since the funeral, and none of the boys wanted to be sitting in this uptight lawyer's office while he read a stupid will. It wasn't as if they didn't know what it was going to say anyway. Their father, of course, had left his fortune to them. That is, what he hadn't already given them in their enormous trust funds. And to their mother and his brother, Uncle Sherman, they were the only living relatives, well, the only ones they knew about at least. So this was a waste of all their time. Can you get on with this? I have things to do, Cooper snapped. You will learn some respect by the end of this, Sherman warned Coop. Yeah, I get it, Coop said. Can I go now? I don't want to hear the rest. I think you do, their mother said. Her sweet voice instantly calmed the boys. They did love their mother, had a great deal of respect for her, and listened when she spoke. But they had hardened through the years, taking for granted what had been given to them. That was about to change. You won't receive a dime of your inheritance until you've proven that you will actually better not only your lives but the lives of others. Cooper spoke first. What in the hell is that supposed to mean? He was up on his feet, his chair flying backward with the momentum. His brothers were right behind him. The world was suddenly spinning and none of them knew how to deal with this latest news. If you will shut up and listen, then you will hear the rest, Sherman told them. The four young men were obviously upset, but slowly they resumed their seats. All of them except for Cooper, who stood there with his arms crossed, daggers coming from his eyes. You have 10 years to turn your lives around. At the end of that 10 years, if you haven't proven yourselves self-sufficient, by working hard, being respectful to your mother and your uncle, and bringing something to the society that you live in, then your inheritance will be donated to charity. The attorney paused as if he were reluctant to read whatever else was coming next. Get on with it, Ace growled. Your mother and I shared a wonderful, beautiful, exciting life together. A man isn't meant to be alone. He's meant to love, to share, to grow with a woman who will help guide him through the hardest parts of his life. The attorney began. What in the world are you speaking about? Maverick snapped. Son, this is in your father's own words, so I would pay attention. Uncle Sherman said, his tone sad. Maverick leaned forward, but he didn't seem to be hearing anything that was being spoken at that moment. Shall I continue? The attorney asked. Yeah, Cooper said with a wave of his hand. You will receive your full inheritance once you marry. Dead silence greeted those words as the boys looked at one another, and then at their mother, who had a serene smile on her face. Finally, Cooper was the one to speak again. Mom, what in the hell is going on? She gave her son a sad smile. Your father and I have watched the four of you lose your way these past several years. He knew he was dying, and he'd run out of time to guide you, shape you. He didn't want to lose you forever, as I don't. So he changed the will. The boys waited for her to go on, but she sat there silently. We're rich without his money, Nick pointed out. She was quiet for several moments. Yes, Nick, you are, she finally said. Are you going to take away what we already have? Maverick asked. No, I'm not, Evelyn Armstrong told them all. You don't have to get your inheritance, though it makes your trust funds look like pennies, as you know. But getting the money isn't the point, she said with a sigh. What is the point? Cooper asked, trying desperately not to yell, but only because his mother was in the room. The point is to grow up. You need to grow up, Evelyn said as she looked each of the boys in the eyes before turning to Sherman. Your father wants you to be good men. He's asking you to show your mother that you are, Sherman added. So even in death, father wants us to jump through hoops? Ace snapped. No, son. Even in death your father wants you to grow into the men you are meant to be. Evelyn told them. I don't need his stupid money. I have plenty of it that he's already given me, and besides that I have my own plans. If he thinks I'm such a screw-up, then he can keep it all, Cooper thundered. Agreed, Nick snapped. I'm not doing anything, because someone is trying to force it upon me, Maverick said, joining his brothers. If he thinks we're such screw-ups, he can go to hell, Ace said, pushing it a bit too far. Ace, Coop whispered. Save it, Cooper. You're always trying to be the leader, but this is crap. Yeah, I'm the baby of the family, but that just means that I've had to try to make up for every mistake that you guys have already made. I'm done with it, Ace bellowed. Calm down, son, Sherman said, rising and resting a hand on Ace's shoulder. No, Ace yanked away from Sherman, and then moved toward the door. I love you all no matter what you choose, but I hope you'll listen to your father's last words. And know he does this because he loves you, Evelyn said quietly, stopping Ace for a moment. Then his eyes hardened. I'm out of here. Ace was the first to leave. He rushed from the attorney's office, fury heating the very air around him. Cooper stood there dumbfounded. What was happening? They'd not only lost their father, but they'd all just found out that they had never been good enough in his eyes. To hell with Dad, and to hell with this place. Cooper followed his brother, though Ace was already long gone. It didn't matter. Cooper would prove himself. But he'd do it because he wanted to. He would never be someone's puppet. Not even his father's. Chapter 1. What in the world was he doing at the lavish Anderson wedding of Crew Storm and his bride, Haley? He didn't want to be there. Didn't want to be around anyone. Actually. But he feared his friends were going to call in the National Guard. At any minute if he didn't come out. And at least pretend he was still somewhat normal. It had only been 6 months since his father's passing. There'd been zero word from Ace. And though he talked to his other 2 brothers, the conversations were short. All of them were dealing with their demons and the final words of their father. He hadn't spoken more than a few words to his mother, which he knew was terrible. But he couldn't see her while he was like this. It's really good to see you out, Co-op. Mark Anderson stood next to him as they scanned the merry crowd celebrating all around them. Cooper couldn't even try to smile. His lips just weren't turning up. I haven't felt much like celebrating lately, Cooper admitted to his friend. I understand that. I don't know how I would survive it if my dad died. The man's meddling and always in my face, but I love him. I think the old guy is too damn ornery to let go anyway. He's gonna outlive us all, Mark said with a chuckle. Yes, I agree with you. Joseph is a force to be reckoned with, Cooper said, his lips twitching the slightest bit. It was almost a smile. Are you enjoying your new job? Mark asked. Cooper paused as he thought about the question. He was doing exactly what his father had wanted, even if he was doing it in spite of his dad. He was working for a small airline, using the skill that had been nothing but a hobby for him up until recently. I don't know about enjoying the actual job and the paperwork that comes with it. But yes, flying is what I love. I can't seem to get enough of it. Who knew that playing with planes my whole life would turn into a career? Cooper said. Even without your inheritance, you're a very wealthy man, Cooper. It isn't as if you have to work. But before you say something, I know it isn't about a paycheck. I don't have to work myself. But choosing to work despite my fortune is a matter of pride, Mark told him. I didn't have much pride, Cooper said with a shrug. Or at least I didn't think I did. Not until that reading of my father's will. I guess he was right in the sense that we have all sort of skated through life. But he raised us that way. I don't know what he expected. I think when people know their time is coming to a close, they start to get scared. Mark said. Not that I would know from personal experience, but now that I'm a father, I get scared. I want my kids to grow into fine men and women. They work on the ranch. And they even go into the Anderson offices and are learning there. Aren't your kids really young? Cooper asked. Yeah, but I was a bit spoiled myself. I don't want that for my kids, Mark told him. Well, I don't know what earning only a couple grand a month proves. But my father seemed to think that would make me a man. So now instead of flying for fun, I fly for an airline. It's not so bad. It just all pisses me off a little, Cooper said. The anger will eventually drain, Mark told him. I don't know. Cooper stopped talking as he scanned the crowd. Coming to the party had been a very bad idea. Maybe it was time for him to take his leave. He wasn't fit company to be around at the moment. Just as his scan was almost finished, something caught his eye. He stopped and zeroed in on a woman in the corner, sitting by herself. Mark continued to speak, but Cooper didn't hear what his friend was saying. He was too focused on the blonde woman in the tight red dress, who was holding her drink close to her like it was a lifeline. She nervously glanced around the room, not meeting his gaze, before she looked back down again. Cooper was shocked at the stirring he felt. It had been a long time since he'd felt any emotion other than anger. Who is that? He asked Mark, interrupting his friend mid-sentence. Mark followed his gaze and looked at the woman for several moments. I have no idea. Haven't seen her before, Mark said. Then he smiled. But I have a feeling you're about to find out. Don't overanalyze this, Mark. I'm just curious who she is, Cooper snapped. No judgments here, Mark assured him with a pat on the shoulder. I might like to screw the ladies, but I won't give my father the pleasure of marrying one, he said with a little growl. What does that mean? Mark asked, looking a little lost. My father seemed to think a man's life isn't complete without a wife. I think all women search for a man with the deepest pockets, he said. Mark gave him a sad look and shook his head. Not all women are like that. I married a good one. Then you got the last, Cooper said with conviction. Then he walked away. He didn't know why. But he had to meet this woman who was trying to hide away. It was sex, that was all. And sex was worth throwing down a few dollars for, he thought with a cynical smile. Chapter 2. Stormy Halifax would have given anything for the ability to fade into the background. She tried in vain to squeeze herself back even farther into the corner. As she watched the designer-clad couples swirling around on the dance floor, all of them laughing, and completely at home surrounded by the glamour and glitz of the night. Only American royalty like the Andersons could afford to pull off a wedding like this one. Stormy would bet her entire bank account, which actually wasn't that much, that she couldn't have afforded even a single flower among the many placed so elegantly in the hundreds of exquisitely designed centerpieces. She eyed the door longingly. Just a few more hours. How had she ever let Lindsay convince her it was a good idea to crash the society wedding of the century? If Stormy made it through the evening undetected, she swore she would never listen to her best friend again. Of course, how many times in her life had she had that same thought? Too many times to count. At least she sort of looked like she fit in with the crowd, or somewhat fit in. That meant she looked nothing like herself on this beautiful summer night in Seattle. Lindsay had insisted she wear the ridiculously tight red dress. She currently felt plastered to her skin, and her friend had layered on so much makeup that Stormy felt like a clown, with the dyed blonde hair taking the place of her naturally brown hair. She barely recognized herself. When she had gotten a look at herself in one of the gilded mirrors hanging on the walls of the banquet hall, Stormy could hardly believe she was staring at her own reflection. The girl in the mirror almost looked like she belonged at the lavish wedding. Almost. At least she looked old enough to drink, even if she wouldn't be for a few more weeks. She reached up and clasped the chain around her neck, feeling more secure, if only slightly. She never left home without the simple piece of jewelry she'd designed herself. Stormy scanned the room for Lindsay. Only the flies on the wall would know what excitement her friend was off having. Lindsay certainly wasn't hiding in a corner somewhere. Enough was enough. With or without Lindsay, Stormy needed an exit strategy. She gathered up her glittering clutch, slipped her feet back into the ridiculously high stiletto heels she had borrowed from Lindsay, and then covertly tried to make her way to the door. She was mere inches from freedom when she felt a solid, masculine hand touch her bare shoulder. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze. Busted. Okay, play it cool, Stormy. Just smile. Pretend like you belong here for 5 more seconds, and then make a run for it. Are you lost? The deep baritone of the voice sent a shiver down her spine. She really wanted to turn and look at him, but at the same time she didn't. Cowardice wasn't normally one of her traits, but she was in uncharted territory, and she was trying to flee. No, but thank you. She took another step. Are you refusing to have a conversation with me? Now she seemed rude. His voice didn't change, but she could swear there was a challenge in it. Damn it. Stormy couldn't resist a challenge. Stormy finally turned, and when she looked up, she found herself gazing into a set of sea-green eyes with the longest eyelashes she'd ever witnessed on a man before. She found herself speechless. Let's dance, he said, holding out a hand, not concerned by her lack of vocal abilities. This wasn't a good idea. I don't think so. I really need to go, she told him. But he didn't remove his outstretched hand, and she didn't want to pull away and call attention to them having this conversation. What if the people standing around realized she was crashing this wedding? She was going to murder her best friend if she ever found her again. One dance won't take long. The deep timbre of his voice made her stomach stir. Oh, his dark hair was rumpled, and his stark white shirt, unbuttoned at the top, showed a nice view of his tan chest. And those shoulders, oh those shoulders, looked as if they could carry a roof trestle on them. There was a bit of youthfulness in his face, but he had to be a few years older than she was. What was one dance going to hurt? The racing of her blood proved she wouldn't dislike it. Heck, even if she were caught, it might just be worth it to have this man's arms around her for a few minutes. He said nothing else as he waited, confident she would cave. He was right. She watched a smile lift the corners of his mouth as he moved a little closer, and she knew she was a goner. His smell was wafting over her, a mixture of spice and leather. She almost giggled as the verse sugar and spice, and everything nice flitted through her frazzled brain cells. Wait. That was for girls, not for drool-worthy men. I guess one dance wouldn't hurt, she finally said. The shiver that rushed through her had nothing to do with the warm evening air. She wished she could say it was chilly out. Without saying anything more, the stranger leaned down and took her hand. In his slightly work-roughened fingers, he pulled her toward him, casually wrapping his arm around her waist, his hand resting on her now trembling ribcage, as he led her toward the overflowing dance floor. Without hesitation, he turned her, pulled her tightly against his hard body, and began swaying to the music. She couldn't even concentrate on the song that was playing. He was holding her so close. Her heart was beating out of control. Wasn't this something she'd fantasized about many times? On those lonely nights that she lay in bed, after putting aside her favorite romance book? She'd close her eyes and picture a handsome man finding her sitting alone somewhere. He'd have a smile that could light up a darkened room, but his gleaming eyes would look no farther than her. As she began to relax and enjoy the moment, a woman's laughter made her tense all over again. Panic flooded her. What if this really was a dream? The dream she wanted to come true so bad? Maybe someone had even spiked that second glass of champagne. She knew she should have turned down. This was too unbelievable to be real. After all, men like this man didn't dance with wallflowers like her. As her arms rested around the back of his neck, she reached for her own hand and gave it a quick pinch. She knew she looked ridiculous, but she had to be sure this was real. The little jolt of pain drew a quiet squeak from her lips. Oh yes, she was awake. She didn't know whether to be elated or terrified by that fact. Is everything all right? He asked, leaning back, those green eyes gazing into hers, just as she'd always imagined. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. Her cheeks flamed as he looked at her, a knowing gleam in his eyes. She was busted and she knew it, but there was nothing else she could do, so she continued to sway in his arms. I've been watching you for the past 10 minutes. I couldn't keep my eyes off you, he told her. Oh my. This man was either incredibly smooth, or she really had conjured up her dream man. Either way, she decided to enjoy this moment to its fullest. She found herself gazing at his lips as he spoke. He had beautiful lips, strong, firm, masculine, and turned up in the most appealing way. Thank you, she told him, feeling like a fool as she uttered the words. Are you here for the bride or the groom? He asked. The dreaded question should have panicked her. But she was almost in a trance now and couldn't help but answer honestly. Neither. I snuck in with my friend. I can't find her now. His eyes crinkled, though still. There was something restless about him that she couldn't quite interpret. Something was wrong. But before she could analyze that, the feel of him pressing against her wiped anything other than desire away from her thoughts. Stormy didn't have a clue who in the world she was right now. She certainly wasn't this woman dancing with this man. She'd had sex once before, 2 years prior with her high school sweetheart. That had been a disaster, and she'd never tried it again. Dancing with this man was making her think maybe another try wouldn't be so bad. Did that make her an awful person? She didn't know. When he stopped moving, she felt her throat close. She wasn't ready for him to release her. But he pulled back anyway, and where she'd felt his warmth down her entire front, she now felt cold. Then she noticed the music had stopped. Maybe it was midnight, and time for Cinderella to go home. Let's take a walk. He began leading her away from the dance floor before she responded. His confidence was overwhelming her, but it didn't matter. There was no hesitation on her part as joy filled her. Later, she might ask herself why that was, but for now, she was in her dream world. The sounds of the party began fading as they moved away from the tents and lights and then down a trail. As he slowly walked next to her, with trees on either side of them, and the moonlight barely filtering through, Stormy wondered if she should be afraid. As his hand caressed her lower back, though, all she felt was an overwhelming sense of desire and rightness. Not knowing why it felt right didn't matter. She soon found herself on a sandy beach, her shoes dangling from her fingers as she looked out at Puget Sound, the waves splashing gently against the shore. There was very little breeze, and the full moon gave everything a soft light. This is incredible. I can't imagine being so lucky as to live here, she told the man. That's when she realized she didn't even know his name. Should she ask him? Or would that break their moment together? She sort of liked the mystery of it all. I think Joseph's place is a little too close to the hustle and bustle of Seattle. But I do love the sound. It's a great waterway. Are you here very often? Was she being nosy now? Yes. I don't live too far away. He stopped walking, and she stood next to him, enjoying the clasp of his fingers in hers. Sit with me. He again didn't wait for a response, simply led her to a log, and then sat down, pulling her to his side as they gazed out at the water. He put an arm around her, and the feel of his hard muscles enveloping her gave her both a sense of peace and panic at the same time. She tried to remember a time she'd ever felt so much agitation at just the mere touch of a man. But she couldn't think of a single moment. Only this man, only right now. I don't live far away either, she finally said, the silence too intimate. Should they exchange information? Was that what she wanted? Or what he wanted? When he was silent for several moments, her brain spun. She began wondering if she was being a fool. This could be simply a case of a man trying to hook up at a wedding. It happened all the time, didn't it? Did she really want to be that girl the guys laughed about in the morning? She realized she didn't actually care what gossip might spur from this. Maybe she should be more worried. But how often in her life had she done something reckless? Not very often at all. What this man was stirring up inside of her, she couldn't understand and didn't want to stop feeling. Where exactly are you from? He asked. The question helped slow her racing heart. I've lived all over the world, in my youth. Mostly third world kind of accommodations. That had the man silent for a moment. Then he raised an eyebrow in curiosity. You can't just leave me like that. Go on, he told her. My mom and dad were missionaries until I was about 10. Then they worked modest jobs after that, she began. I was born in Portland, Oregon, but I lived abroad with my parents for half of my life. Then in the Portland area after that. After I turned 18, I decided to move to Seattle. Now you have me curious of all the places you've been. Gosh, let me think, she said. Africa, South America, Asia for a short time, and a few more places. Noticing she had his undivided attention bolstered her confidence and made her want to keep sharing. It was sort of nice. Of all the places you've lived, which one was your favorite? His fingers were playing with her hair, making little flutters in her stomach. I can honestly say I've loved every place I've lived, save maybe a few apartments I've had in the city. But of all the places. Stormy looked up at the starry sky to recall the fondness of a distant place in her memory. I'd have to say it was Kosovo. Kosovo? Where exactly is that? In the Mediterranean somewhere, right? No, it's not exactly in the Mediterranean, as it's landlocked on all sides. But it's right next door to Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania. It's a fantastic place. Incredibly dangerous at the time. But it was cool, she began. I mean, one minute you'd be drinking Turkish coffee at a cafe, and hear a car driving by playing Eurodance pop on the stereo, while the next car to pass would be blasting dance music in Arabic. The country was a collision of Western and Eastern European culture, with distinct flavors from Turkey and the Middle East. Being a Westerner, of course, gave me instant celebrity status, which as a preteen, I didn't mind so much. That's always nice for a teen, he said as he pulled her even closer. The thing was, for Stormy, it felt right. Somehow she was connecting more with this stranger than any other person she'd ever been with before. What do you do, Cinderella? She smiled at the name. Hadn't she been thinking about how this all felt like a dream? Like she was going to disappear when the clock struck 12? His words fit how she was feeling. My job isn't interesting. She hedged. And then she found herself playing with the locket hanging around her neck. But I love to design jewelry, she admitted while her cheeks flamed the tiniest bit. Why had she told him that? His fingers clasped the locket she'd been clutching as he moved to study it. This is beautiful, he told her. Did you make it? Yes, she shyly admitted. You have a real talent, he told her, making her more nervous. Why did this man's opinion matter at all? It shouldn't. But somehow it did. It's just a silly dream of mine. It can't lead anywhere, she told him with a laugh. He let go of the locket and gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. She was voiceless as his gaze held hers captive. Dreams are meant to become reality. Don't ever think you can't do something just because it's difficult. She knew there was a story behind his words. She desperately wanted to know what that story was. I think it's time for you to share something about yourself, she said, very aware of how close his lips were to hers. No, I think we've talked enough for now, he said with a slow smile that melted her from the inside out. Then she was moving. Effortlessly, he lifted her and sat her across his lap as he gazed down into her eyes. She was lost as his head slowly lowered, the moonlight glinting in his sparkling eyes. I'm going to kiss you, he said, waiting only a moment to give her a chance to say no. Maybe she should refuse. After all, she didn't even know the guy's name. But she didn't want to refuse him or deny herself. She wanted to see if his kiss was going to be even better than his touch. His head descended, and then those exquisite lips of his were on hers. And she couldn't think anymore. The kiss was better than she could have ever expected. Her mouth opened to his, and he was caressing her in a way no one had ever done before. She felt the gentle touch of his tongue trace the edges of her lips, before surging forward and commanding her mouth. Shivers traveled through her frame as she rubbed her body against this man, trying to relieve the ache she didn't quite understand. When he pulled away, she leaned against him, not wanting the connection to end. My boat is right over there against the dock. Say the word and we can go and have a drink or something more. His fingers were lightly trailing up and down her back, and his eyes shone down at her clearly, the full moon making it seem more like dusk instead of closer to midnight. This is where she should tell him thank you, but no thank you. Instead, she felt herself nodding as she looked up at him. I'd like a drink, she said. He hesitated a moment longer, and Stormy couldn't read the look in his eyes. But right then, she knew that she didn't want him to change his mind. Because if he continued walking her to the boat, she was going to do the first seriously reckless thing of her life. She was going to sleep with a stranger. Then he smiled. Right this way. He stood with her still in his arms. And then he let her go so that her feet touched the sand. She hadn't realized she'd risen to her toes in an effort to taste even more of his kiss. Excitement and a feeling of trepidation warred within her. But as her fingers remained tightly bound with his, the excitement won out. They made their way down a dock lined with several beautiful watercrafts. Her sexy mystery man led her to one of the boats, and she stood before it and gasped. This is what you call a boat? She asked, hesitating before stepping to the plank that led onto it. Yes. He seemed confused. She suddenly giggled. Who in the world was this man? This is bigger than my place, she told him. If her night ended because he realized she wasn't one of the rich and famous, then so be it. She could only fake so much about herself and being impressed. With the giant yacht in front of her was out of her control. Yeah, I got this several years ago. I guess it's a bit extreme, he said with a shrug as he shifted on his feet. He wasn't running away from her yet. That was good. The sleek yacht spanned at least 100 feet, and it wasn't even the biggest at the massive docks. That's what was scary about this world of wealth she'd stumbled upon. But the part above the water appeared to have 2 floors. She didn't know what was below the water's line. Finally, she allowed him to lead her on board, where she looked at the red hardwood floors and lush furniture. Once inside the cabin, she couldn't even tell they were on a boat anymore. Unless she concentrated on the gentle rocking motion, she could barely feel. I didn't know boats had such large rooms, she said nervously as he led her to a living area. He guided her to a comfortable chair, and then stepped over to a big walnut bar, with a giant mirror and shelves behind it. I don't like to feel closed in, he said before chuckling. She had to wonder what he found so funny, but she wasn't going to ask. I noticed you with champagne earlier. I'll get you another, he told her. In only moments, Green Eyes was sitting next to her, handing her a beautiful crystal champagne flute. She clutched its long stem, and immediately took a swallow. She'd had a few glasses at the wedding reception, but the effects were wearing off, and she didn't want to chicken out on this once-in-a-lifetime adventure. They sat together and she sipped her champagne, enjoying the quiet of the boat. Her eyes roamed the yacht's opulent cabin, and occasionally stole a glance at the man who'd brought her there. When she'd emptied her glass, he refilled it. She leaned back and smiled at him. She wasn't sure what to do next, so her lips were probably twitching a little. Maybe it's time we exchanged names, he said after the long silence. She was feeling a nice buzz now and decided to play it bold. I don't think so, she told him. He turned his head to the side and his brow wrinkled. Why not? Because I'm enjoying the mystery of all this. I've never done anything like it before. She clutched her hands in her lap and twisted her fingers, but then forced herself to stop. She didn't want him to see how unsophisticated she truly was. Done what before? He asked. Gone off with a man I've just met. There's nothing wrong with taking a walk, or having a drink together. He scooted closer to her, his fingers rubbing along her bare knee. She was grateful she wasn't wearing stockings. She wanted nothing between his touch and her flesh. Ah, but that's not all we're going to do, is it, Green Eyes? She said. Damn. Her cheeks instantly flushed after she threw those saucy words at him. She was playing with fire, and she hoped to get burned. I hope not, he said after a moment's silence. And then he was smiling wider than the Cheshire Cat. Stormy sensed the atmosphere change in the room, and she felt a little light-headed as the sexual tension swirled around her. Green Eyes set down his glass, took the empty one from her fingers, and then stood up, pulling her straight into his arms. This time he didn't hesitate when he kissed her. This time, it was fast and hard, and her knees gave out on her. But he was right there to catch her. And she knew she'd made the right decision. Chapter 3. As the yacht slowly rocked on the water, Cooper Armstrong looked over at the beautiful woman sleeping naked beside him. Perfection on his bed. Just an hour before, they'd had the best sex of his entire life. That was certainly saying something since he hadn't exactly been a saint in his days. His Cinderella had tried to insist on leaving right after, but it had already been 4 a.m. He'd promised to get her a taxi at dawn, yet he was reconsidering her leaving so soon. He was even harder now than he'd been an hour ago, and he wanted her again. He wasn't even sure one more time would be enough. From the moment he'd spotted this woman at the wedding, he'd been feeling all sorts of emotions other than rage from his father's passing and the reading of the will. He wasn't quite ready to have her depart and let the good feeling end. Who was this woman? And more importantly, what was she doing to him? From that very first glance into her somewhat terrified deep brown eyes, and at the moo of her sensual pink lips, he'd had to walk over to her, had to see how she'd feel in his arms. Maybe the two of them would make love one more time, and then he'd be able to let her go. He didn't have time for a relationship, and he sure as hell didn't want one. Women couldn't be trusted, not when he had a bank account that made him more attractive in their eyes. He knew he was a catch. It wasn't arrogance, it was fact. When a person had his looks, his wallet, and his ambition, it made him the perfect target. But the women of the world didn't know that he wasn't taking the bait. His goal was always to get what he wanted from a woman, give her the pleasure of his masterful bedroom skills, and then quickly slip away before the hook could slide into his flesh and snare him. Even as he had this thought, he began running his hand lightly down his mystery woman's sleek body, the span of his fingers almost covering the width of her back. She began to stir, but didn't quite wake, not even when he turned her so her luscious breasts were fully available to his touch. Running his finger over each one in turn, he smiled as they instantly hardened for him. She shifted, and he knew the best way to rouse her from her sleep. He bent down and licked one nipple, before sucking it into his mouth and gently clamping his teeth over it. She groaned, making his erection pulse painfully, as Cooper kissed his way back up to her neck. She reached for him, and he took her red lips with his. He could worship this woman's body night and day, and still never have enough of her. That was a sobering thought, and he didn't want to sober up, not yet. When she trailed her hand down his abs and cupped his manhood, he lurched upward into a sitting position. He was so close to releasing right then and there. How had that happened? It's almost morning, he mumbled. Morning, she replied somewhat shyly. I know I promised you a taxi when you woke up, but I had another idea first. He told her, his fingers whispering along her skin. She moaned again, and he was hopeful she would agree. I need a few minutes, she told him, and he nearly panicked as she sat up. He wasn't ready for this to end yet. Okay, he told her, and he was the one wanting to whimper. When she climbed from his bed and walked into his bathroom, he lay back on the bed and reached down to squeeze his erection, trying to lessen the infernal pulsing. It didn't help. When he heard the shower come on, he sat back up. Should he follow her or not? When he couldn't stand it anymore, he jumped up from the bed, opened the bathroom door, and grinned as steam hit him full in the face. She obviously enjoyed very hot showers. But he could make it even hotter. The mirror had already fogged up, and when he drew the curtain aside, the sight of this woman, with water glistening off her body, had him dripping in excitement. He just stood there for a moment as she rubbed her slim fingers down her breasts, across the flat plane of her stomach, and dipped into the folds of her womanhood while cleaning herself. Enough of this watching. Cooper stepped inside the shower with her, and when she opened those dark eyes of hers, which were already filled with wanton delight, he nearly fell to his knees. "You are so damn sexy," he groaned, pushing her back against the coolness of the tile wall and making her gasp. "Only with you," she admitted. That knowledge was the most intense aphrodisiac ever. He moved his hands oh so slowly from her hips, up her sides and around the edges of her breasts. His magic fingers came close to her swollen nipples, but not close enough. She groaned her displeasure at the way he was teasing her. After looking into her expressive eyes, he finally let his thumbs glance over those hard peaks, before sliding his hands to her stomach and circling them behind her to squeeze the cheeks of her firm ass. "Kiss me," she said, and she reached behind his head and pulled him to her. He was more than happy to oblige. Running his tongue over her lips, he quickly parted them and thrust inside, in just the way he wanted to thrust into her heat. She drew him more tightly to her and returned his kiss with the same intense passion. A cry of pleasure escaped her beautiful lips when he slid a hand back around and rubbed his fingers against her wet heat, and then pinched her little bundle of nerves, making her shake. "I need to taste you," he said, after ripping his mouth away from her lips. He licked his way down her chest and dropped to his knees, gripping her thighs. He pushed them apart and looked up at her smooth perfection, her sweet folds gleaming with water and pleasure. He ran his hand up and didn't stop until he'd buried 2 fingers deep within her. Only then did he lean forward to suck the most sensitive part of her into his mouth, flicking his tongue repeatedly against it, as his fingers found a perfect rhythm of pumping in and out of her. His midnight woman clutched his head tightly, and her cries told him she was coming closer and closer to release. Yes, he wanted to give her pleasure, over and over and over again. So he didn't stop pleasing her with his fingers and tongue until she screamed and almost crumpled right there in front of him. Cooper stood up quickly, more than ready to be inside this woman. Bracing his foot on the tiled shower bench, he lifted one of her legs and draped it over his so his hardness was poised at her entrance, her thighs spread wide. He gripped himself and rubbed his arousal along the open seam of her pink core. "Oh, that's so good. Please. More," she moaned, leaning her head against the shower wall. Moving his manhood up and down over her swollen nub a few times more, he waited until he was coated in her juices. Then he poised himself for entry. "Open your eyes," he commanded her. She opened them just a little, and after pulling her up, he slid all the way inside her tight heat. Her mouth opened in a gasp, and he took the opportunity to thrust his tongue inside in perfect rhythm with the way he was plunging into her body, all while gripping her delectable derriere. The sound of their wet bodies slapping against each other was driving Cooper wild. He sped up and almost poured his seed into her when she tightened around him again. She gave another long and impassioned cry. He stopped thrusting and held her as she shuddered in ecstasy, and he gently caressed her mouth and squeezed her buttocks. When she slumped against him again, he pulled from her, an act of amazing willpower. "I'm so worn out," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It's not over, beautiful, not yet," he whispered into her ear. "I can't do any more," she told him. "Oh yes, yes you can," he assured her. Her eyes flew up, and he smiled at her before he turned her around and pressed his arousal against the exquisite cushion of her ass. "Grip the edge of the bench," he told her as he pushed against her upper back. She leaned down, leaving her derriere up in the air. Dropping to his knees, he bit each of those cheeks in turn, before soothing the red spots with his tongue. And then he stood again and rested his pulsing erection in the valley she was presenting to him, enjoying how perfect the deep red looked against her light skin. With his foot, he pushed her legs apart, wider, wider, even wider. When she was fully opened up to him, he reached around and found her still swollen nub, which he stroked a few times, making her twitch against him. With his other hand, he guided himself down the middle of her ass until he reached her core, and then he thrust back inside her. Now it was time for them both to feel pleasure. She groaned as he moved his hand between her folds, up her belly to her tender nipples, and then back again. He continued caressing her with one hand while gripping her hip with the other, thrusting and thrusting. "Come for me one more time, baby," he told her as he felt his release drawing nearer. He flicked his fingers against her butt and she screamed, as she convulsed around him so intensely that he almost reached orgasm without any movement at all. But he had to move. Pushing deep inside her, he released a hot stream of pleasure, pulsing over and over again until he was entirely drained. When he could finally take a step back, Cooper felt lost pulling away from her heat, and she nearly collapsed before him, but he was able to catch her. It was I don't even know how. She was clearly at a loss for words. It was perfect, he told her as he lifted her in his arms, and then stepped from the shower. He grabbed a couple of towels before carrying her back to his room. He dried her off before laying her down gently on the bed, and he quickly dried himself. Then he joined her, pulling her back into his arms. He wasn't willing to let her go just yet, or anytime soon for that matter. He'd be careful, he assured himself. This was only sex, just really, really good sex. The thought didn't appease him like it should have. As he finally closed his eyes and fell into an exhausted slumber. Chapter 4. Never before had Stormy had to do the walk of shame, but as she grabbed her tiny handbag and slowly crept away from Green Eye's bedroom, she glanced back over her shoulder and took in a deep breath. Dang, the man was good-looking, beyond good-looking actually, especially now, with stubble on his strong jawline, and his muscled arm thrown up above his head, the blankets resting very low on his beautiful hips. Just a few more inches. No, she didn't need to entertain that thought. This was a man she would never see again. Their only connection was the Anderson wedding, a wedding she'd crashed. Her one night of debauchery couldn't cause any repercussions. When she was on the upper deck of his boat, she peeked out to see whether anyone was around. How paranoid was that? It was about 8 in the morning, and the wedding reception had gone on long into the night. Everyone was most likely asleep and cruising for a champagne bruising. Still, she was going to have to trek back up the trail they'd come down the night before, sneak out to the front gate, which had seemed to be a mile from the Anderson castle, and then pray that it was open. The last thing she wanted to do was trudge back to the house and beg someone to let her out. They'd know exactly what she'd been doing, and even though they had no idea who she was, and she would never see them again, her embarrassment would be incalculable. She knew it shouldn't matter, but she cared about what people thought of her. Stormy made it to the top of the trail, and then peered out at the house, surprised to see activity in the backyard. Trucks were there hauling things away, and the yard was almost back to normal, or what she assumed was normal, after that enormous party. Wow, these Anderson people moved really fast. Putting her head down, she walked as quickly as her body-hugging little red dress would allow. She made no eye contact with anyone as she hurried along. "Hello there." The boisterous voice startled her so much. She dropped her purse and jumped into the air. As she came back down off balance, the heel on her shoe snapped, and after wobbling for a moment, she landed hard on her rear end. "I'm so sorry, darling," the man said, a freaking giant. He approached quickly, moving far faster than she would think a man his age could. Bending down, he reached for her hand and easily tugged her back to her feet, where she teetered on the broken shoe. She had no doubt that this was the famous Joseph Anderson, and she fully understood his reputation as a man to whom no one could ever say no. "Don't worry about it. I was in my own world," she said, looking way up at his concerned expression. He had to be many, many inches over 6 feet. She only stood 5 feet 6, in heels, and she was now short one of those. His silver hair only made him more distinguished in her opinion, and the twinkle in his surprisingly sharp blue eyes made her instantly inclined to trust him. "Come on inside and we'll get you fixed up," he insisted as he pulled her toward the house. She stumbled behind him. Oh, maybe she could imagine telling him no after all. She wasn't going into his house. Not a chance. She had to get away before Green Eyes awoke. "Oh no. I was just getting ready to leave," she said, trying without success to tug against the beast of a man. I can't send you off without making sure you're all right. Not after causing you to fall, Joseph said. I promise you I'm okay. I really just want to get going now, she said as she continued to stumble along after him. He stopped and looked at her, and Stormy's cheeks flushed at what he must be thinking. He had to know she'd just walked away from someone's bed. He must be wondering which guy it had been. Maybe he was worried about it being one of his kin. For all she knew, Green Eyes was related to Joseph. The man had sported a really nice boat that was docked on the Anderson Pier. I'm Joseph Anderson, by the way, he said, releasing his protective grip on her hand. It seemed as though he expected her to now introduce herself. Something she absolutely didn't want to do. It's very nice to meet you, Mr. Anderson. As I said, I'm doing just fine, so I'll be on my way, she said as she retreated. The first thing she did was remove her shoes and grip them tightly in one hand. Where's your car parked, miss? He trailed off, obviously waiting for her to give her name again. I rode here with a friend. I've called a cab, and it's picking me up at the gate, so I'd best hurry, she said. She hadn't yet called the damned cab, but she was planning to as soon as she escaped from the intimidating Anderson patriarch. Then I'll walk you to the gate, Joseph said. This walk of shame just kept on getting worse and worse. Now the man was going to catch her in a lie. Her humiliation was complete. Well, I haven't actually called the cab yet. I was just getting ready to when I ran into you, so I had best get going and do that. By the time I get to the gate, the cab will be waiting for me, she said with a sheepish laugh. Nonsense, young lady. If you were a guest at the party, I insist on having my driver give you a ride home, Joseph said, once again tugging on her arm. Stormy gasped. I couldn't have you do that. I won't take no for an answer. And that was why the man always got his way, she decided. Within a minute, a black car pulled up. A man emerged from the driver's side and opened the back door for her. Stormy found herself practically pushed into the car. And the only relief she felt was when the car pulled away from the Anderson mansion. She didn't look back to see Joseph reach down and pick up the locket that had dropped from her neck, or the smile he wore as he held it. All fairy tales must come to an end, and when she got home and walked inside, she was cruelly thrust back into the real world. Her carriage was now a pumpkin again, and her glass slipper left behind. Chapter 5. 6 years later. Sitting on the deck of his favorite cafe in the old neighborhood, Sherman Armstrong leaned back as another roar of thunder sounded high in the sky. He knew he was the very image of the old grandfather resting in his favorite chair. While children ran by wondering about him, he liked that mystery about himself. He was a stout man, though his body was a bit older and weaker now, and he was forced to use a cane while walking. He had a square jaw, bit too big of a nose, and had sometimes been called Dumbo because of the size of his ears. Yet one thing that was fully working and sharp as ever were his bright blue eyes, which showed an inextinguishable youthfulness and a lot of hard-learned wisdom. Life had taught him things that no one and nothing could ever take away. Though Sherman was an incredibly wealthy man, he didn't have a large wardrobe. He sat on the cafe's deck, wearing his favorite blue cardigan. Tomorrow he'd most likely wear the brown one. Those were the only colors he ever selected for his warm wool sweaters. Of course, he did have a variety of plaid shirts that he mixed with the cardigans. Today he was wearing a green and blue one under his sweater. He'd lived in the house across the street, where apartments now stood, when he was a young buck right out of the military in the 60s. This neighborhood was worn down and sometimes unsafe, but it was where he'd made a life for himself and for his beautiful bride, Betty Sue. It was the place where he'd raised his family, and it was the place he would continue to visit until he took his last breath. His family had told him it was time to move on, but it never would be, not in his opinion. Do you think this storm will hang around for a while? Sherman asked Joseph. He and Joseph Anderson had been friends since they were in grade school, and Sherman valued that friendship more than all the money in his bank account. I sure hope so, Joseph told him. Then maybe I will accept your offer for brunch after we finish our coffee. You have a hell of a view from your place, Sherman said with a laugh. That is very true, my friend. Say the word, and my driver will get us out of here, Joseph told him. Catherine wasn't allowing him to drive in bad weather anymore. Not with his need for speed. and the accident that had almost cost him his life. Looking across the street, he caught a glimpse of Stormy Halifax as she struggled to push open the doors to the apartment complex she lived in, the wind fighting her each step of the way. He had begun to stand to assist her when she managed to push through to the sidewalk. She didn't pause, looking to be in a hurry, as she splashed her nice clean work clothes, while rushing through the puddles of water to get to her waiting taxi. Sitting back down, Sherman smiled and lifted his hand. A frown marred his forehead when she didn't look over. He watched her bend to open the car door, but suddenly she popped back up and then smiled and waved. It was a tradition. She'd been living across the street for 3 years, and if she came down early enough, before she had to rush off to work, she would dash over and chat with him for a few minutes. But even if she couldn't do that, she always left him with a wave and a smile. Sherman had grown very fond of the young woman. As she pulled away, a sad smile flitted across his lips. The young girl was trying to make it on her own. But sometimes a person was stronger, not weaker, for asking for a helping hand in times of need. She was a stubborn one, though, and wouldn't allow him to help her. Well, he thought, as her cab drove down the street on her way to a job that wouldn't take her anywhere. He was going to help her, one way or another. His spreading smile took years away from his wrinkled face. It was a good thing Joseph was with him to brainstorm. She's such a fine young woman. I've been trying to help her for quite some time, but she's determined to do everything on her own. That girl isn't someone who even cares to utter the word defeat, Sherman told Joseph. She looks familiar, Joseph said as he stared after her, searching his memory. What's her story? Her parents were missionaries for a lot of years, and then working class folk. Didn't have a whole lot. Her father died when she was 20, and it was real hard on her. Her mom was sick, so she dropped out of school to take care of her. And then her mother passed last year. She hasn't managed to get back on her feet quite yet. But she will. She was taught young not to complain in life, and she lives by that motto. Sherman said, "There's nothing wrong with asking for help once in a while," Joseph said as the two of them watched the cab disappear. "But I've always admired a woman with a strong backbone. That's the kind of girl who won't be led easily astray." "Yes, I agree with you there," Sherman said. "I was sort of hoping to set her up with one of my nephews, but I can't seem to get them in the same room with her. She's always so busy." "Well, my dear friend, you should have come to me sooner," Joseph boomed with a laugh, making Sherman, who was used to his boisterous friend, jump. "Why is that, Joseph?" "Because if there's one thing I know about, it's matchmaking," Joseph said as he sat back. He pulled out 2 deliciously scented cigars. "We'll need these. This will take a while." "I sure won't turn one down," Sherman said, accepting the fragrant tobacco. The 2 men lit up, and then leaned back, as the thunder moved further north, but still gave them a good show to behold. "Tell me more about this girl," Joseph said. "Stormy is kind. I visit my old friend Penny in those apartments quite often, and if Stormy sees that I'm carrying anything, she'll insist on helping me. And on days like this, when the weather takes a turn for the worse, I guarantee you, she'll swing by after work to make sure everything is okay with Penny, who isn't remembering things so easily these days. Stormy's become like a granddaughter to me, and a few other people in that old apartment building. And I just adore her beautiful heart and her sweet words. I miss her when a few days pass that I don't get to chat," Sherman said. "It sounds like she's made of the good stuff," Joseph said, disappointed he didn't have any sons left to set her up with. Of course, he loved Sherman's nephews like his own, so he'd be happy to see this Stormy with one of Sherman's boys. "Yep, she is. I hate seeing her living all alone. She should be settled down, having a nice young lad to help carry some of her burden. The 40 years I spent with my beautiful wife, before the Lord decided she needed to be elsewhere, were the best years of my life," Sherman said. "I can't imagine what would happen to me if I lost my Catherine," Joseph said. "I still miss Betty every single moment of each day. Now I find joy with other people, but it's never going to be the same. She was my soul mate, and there's no replacement for her. Everyone should have that at least once in their lifetime." "I agree, Sherman. I fully agree," Joseph told his friend. The storm began to clear, and the 2 men heard a jet fly over them. Sherman looked up at the sky with a bit of envy. "You still miss it, don't you?" Joseph asked, completely understanding. "Oh, I miss it each morning I wake up," Sherman assured his friend. What felt like many years before, Sherman had been a pilot for the military, and then privately, crop dusting fields, and eventually flying jetliners. He'd soared high above the clouds, leaving all his cares on the ground. As he sat behind the controls of a powerful jet engine, there were days he'd give just about anything to be up there again, trying to beat the morning sun, as he rushed down a runway, at 100+ miles per hour. Pulling a keychain out of his pocket, he handed the faded blue ring to his friend. The scratched letters of Pan American were still printed on the face. "I remember this," Joseph said with a laugh. "I spent a lot of years with them. It's the keepsake I refuse to let go of," Sherman said. "We all need to have keepsakes from the good old days. But Sherman, when your nephews are married and bringing more family home to you, then you won't look so much at the past anymore. I love my present, and I look forward to the future," Joseph assured him. "I think you are absolutely right, Joseph," Sherman said. He put the keychain away and smiled. And then he grabbed a pen and paper and smiled even more broadly. Let the matchmaking begin. Chapter 6. Stormy was startled from her short slumber by what sounded like someone trying to break down her apartment door. She had finally fallen asleep around 2 in the morning after getting home late from work. Laying there a few more moments, she was furious when the pounding continued. Who would be so rude at such an early hour? It was only 7 o'clock. Finally, when the noise continued on for what seemed to be forever, she threw off her covers with a frustrated sigh and stood up, glancing again at the vintage alarm clock, which was sitting on 2 upside-down milk crates covered with a piece of blue fabric. She realized only a minute had passed. Throwing herself back down on the bed, she refused to answer her door. Though she was now wide awake, she wouldn't reward the person's rude behavior by acknowledging his or her presence. When 5 minutes passed, and the intruder still refused to leave, she finally got up and pulled her pink terry cloth robe around her to stomp across her cold, worn wooden floors. She passed through her sparsely furnished, small living room and stood in front of her door. "Whoever is out there can get the hell away from here before I cock the shotgun I'm currently holding," she said, hoping her voice sounded a lot braver than she felt. Silence greeted her statement. "I'm not kidding. I grew up on an army base, and I know how to use this thing." She lied as she looked down at her sweaty palms. She didn't even own a gun. But the person on the other side of the door didn't know that. Her neighborhood wasn't the worst in town, but it most certainly wasn't the best. Several seconds passed. They seemed like freaking eons. And Stormy put her ear to the door. Only silence greeted her now. Great. The jerk had woken her up and now was running scared. Maybe she should make a recording of her small speech and keep it at the ready for anyone stepping in front of her door. Before the hour of 10 a.m., her hands still a bit shaky, Stormy made sure her security chain was tightly locked in place. Finally, she cracked her door a couple of inches. She peered down the hallway as far as she could see and found no one out there. Had she scared the person off? That thought pleased her immensely. She was one tough girl. Yay for her. Still, she really wanted to know what all the pounding had been about. "Is anyone out there?" she called out. Not a whisper could be heard in return. A little bucked up, she slowly removed the chain and opened her door wide enough to look out to the other side of the hallway. The sound of the door creaking open gave her goosebumps. But when she looked down both sides of the hall, there wasn't a soul in sight. Her eyes narrowed, and she immediately suspected that the creepy college dropout, who lived a few units down, might have been playing a prank on her. He never had a shortage of cheesy pickup lines or dirty jokes to share with anyone of the female gender. Perhaps he had just hammered on the door before heading out, thinking that he was being amusing. Just as she began to turn and close the door, a flat white object on her mat caught her eye. Holding her robe closed with one hand, she reached down with the other and picked up the envelope. Once safely back inside, with her lock securely in place, she noticed that the return address was the rental office of her building. She walked back to her bedroom, which was little more than an alcove with no wall or door. Wondering what the management could be sending her, she tore open the letter. She sat on the edge of her bed and hesitantly pulled the piece of paper out. Oh, how she hoped it was simply an announcement about sink repairs. No such luck. Dear Miss Halifax, remodel to begin in 4 days. This is your final warning. You must be out in 72 hours. Stormy's heart sank in her chest as she crumpled the paper in agitation. She had known this was coming, but still, she'd hoped beyond hope she could get an extension. Finding an affordable place in Seattle wasn't easy, but the new management was trying to spruce up the image of the building for some big investors who were coming in. Damn it. When it rained, it poured. Since everything was going wrong anyway, she decided she would just let it all go and try to forget about it for at least a solid 10 minutes. It was time to get ready for work. Suddenly, a loud clap of thunder erupted close by. She could hear a slight tapping on her window that was increasing in tempo. Fall was quickly approaching in Seattle, and the rainy weather was steadily increasing. Stormy was always invigorated by big storms, not fearful like so many other people. They actually helped to cheer her up, most likely because they were her namesake. She'd been born the night of a great thunderstorm, and her parents had thought her name was literally coming to them from the skies. She had to admit, though, she'd rather watch a storm from a warm, safe place and not go out into the middle of it. She reminded herself again that it was a work day. Maybe it was good the management had woken her. With a sigh, she walked across the cold, broken tile of her bathroom. The bathroom was small and quaint, complete, har, with a toilet, a single shower stall, and a vanity that barely managed to hold her hairbrush, and a few basic beauty products. It was a good thing she wasn't into a lot of cosmetics and skin lotions. She turned the faucet on, then pulled the lever, bouncing on her toes as she waited for what seemed like forever, for the small tank to send anything above freezing through the rusty pipes. When the water reached lukewarm, she jumped in, and then sighed when it finally matched her body temperature. It didn't take long to get ready, and then she was off. The sooner she faced the wet, cold morning, the sooner she'd be out of it. There was a bright side. She arrived in the lobby, just as the rain picked up to a sheeting downpour. Outside the old building, "Are you going out in that, darling?" one of her neighbors asked as she waited for the morning paper to arrive. The widow, Penny, whom Stormy had a soft spot for, had the same routine every single day. "Yes, I have no other choice," Stormy replied. "You know, Missy, if you don't learn how to slow down just a little bit, one day you're going to find that you've let life just up and pass you by." Stormy could feel pressure behind her eyes at the words. "I know that. But sometimes you don't have much of a choice but to keep on running," she said sadly. "There's always a choice, dear." Reaching up to grip the pendant from her lost necklace, her hand fluttered away when she came up with empty skin. It had been 6 years, and she still reached for it. The night she'd lost it, more of her dreams of becoming a jeweler had washed away. Sadness filled her at her neighbor's words, more so than she cared to admit. "Sometimes there's really not a choice," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks for being there for me, Penny. Now stay inside and keep warm." She would actually do well to heed the woman's advice, but she knew she wouldn't. Chapter 7. The sun's rays pierced through the overcast sky as the rain began to subside, and the now warming pavement of Seattle's well-traveled roadways produced puffs of steam that were whirled around by the cars rushing along. The light at a busy Broadway intersection turned red as a sexy Porsche 911 came to a stop, just shy of the crosswalk. Drumming his hands impatiently on the steering wheel was the less than humble airline pilot Cooper Armstrong on his way to Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Cooper was once again in a mad dash to get to work early. Of course, the airplane needed his special attention, and there'd be no flight for the day without his presence. Sure, there were other pilots, but none as good as he was, he thought with a cocky smile. Within seconds, a car pulled alongside him to his left. Giving little thought to the vehicle, he calmly glanced over and saw the passenger window gliding down. Cooper waited to see how hot the woman was who was about to offer her phone number. But instead of a sexy brunette or smoldering redhead, Cooper saw his fellow pilot and good friend Wolf Young. Had he not been so distracted, he would have recognized the dark blue BMW M3 immediately. Wolf could be a little hot-headed, and he had a touch of arrogance. Hell, it was why the two of them got along so damn famously. But one thing they didn't have in common was their idea of punctuality. Wolf certainly liked to push the envelope when it came to getting anywhere on time. "Are you still driving that grandma's car, old man?" Wolf shouted over the sound of his revving engine. Cooper refused to take the bait, all of it anyway. He wasn't about to be late to work, because Wolf had goaded him into a race. "I was about to ask you the same thing," Cooper said with a mocking smile. "Huh. My car will kick your car's ass any day of the week." Wolf revved the engine again for good measure. "Are you ever going to grow up, Wolf?" Cooper asked, though he could feel the adrenaline racing through his veins at his friend's obvious challenge. "Damn. I sure as hell hope not," Wolf shouted. "I'm racing. Let's see if you can keep up." And his window began to go up, though only partway. To his great frustration, Cooper felt his ego taking over his decision-making processes, just as his friend knew would happen. And though Cooper hated that his reactions were so predictable, he couldn't seem to stop his next words. "Fine. You want to find out what this grandma's car can do, Wolf? You'd better prepare yourself for defeat." Cooper shut his window. He could picture the excitement on Wolf's face, and heard Wolf gun the motor in anticipation of starting. The two men watched as the traffic on both sides of the street began to slow, indicating their light was about to change. Both cars surged forward, only held back by their feet on the brakes. As they prepared for the first sign of a green light, time seemed to stand still, then the light finally changed. In an almost simultaneous motion, Cooper and Wolf dumped their clutches and stomped on the gas pedals. With a roar, their cars leapt from the white line. The sound of squealing tires and the smell of smoke filled the air as both cars sped off. Cooper glanced at his speedometer, which was climbing quickly to 65 miles per hour, as they barreled down the city streets. Their cars darted in and out of mid-morning traffic, getting everything from the middle finger to honking horns. Cooper knew in the back of his mind that he'd seen police officers on this road, but his boyish arrogance would never allow him to slow down. Wolf made a sudden attempt at a pass, while Cooper responded with a sharp maneuver to block him. The sound of Wolf's engine downshifting could be heard as Cooper watched him in the rearview mirror. His lead grew as he pushed his Porsche even harder. Cooper knew that Wolf would do anything to win. He'd raced the guy before, and had learned a few of Wolf's tricks and strategies. "Come on, Wolf, make your next move," Cooper silently taunted as they approached the on-ramp to the freeway. Although the traffic was somewhat heavy, the open expanse of the freeway was a golden opportunity. "This is your chance, Coop. Give it all she's got." He quickly shifted into third gear as he turned onto the ramp, looking back to see Wolf only inches away. The cars surged up the ramp, both engines growling as they were pushed to their limits. As Cooper crested the top of the ramp, he refused to be fazed by all the sounds of disapproval. In fact, he accelerated past 100 miles per hour. Cooper's confidence about his upcoming victory was quickly squashed by the sight of Wolf's shiny grille in his rearview mirror. Deciding it was time for some dirty tactics, Cooper cracked an evil smile as he noticed a large truck with its turn signal on that was moving into his lane. Without hesitation or fear, Cooper shifted into fourth gear and hammered down on the pedal. The sound of gravel could be heard under his car as he swerved around the merging truck and slightly onto the shoulder. "Try that on for size." Cooper could see Wolf and his blue car swerving from side to side. While attempting to find a hole, he sped off, taking full advantage. After a couple of minutes, he figured he'd won free and clear. Glancing in his mirror, Cooper could no longer see any sign of Wolf. "Looks like you gave up too easily, my free." "What the?" Cooper could see a BMW fast approaching from his right side, like a bullet fired from a gun. Cooper knew there'd be glee on Wolf's face, taunting Cooper as he drove. His heart pounding, Cooper pressed his engine as hard as it would go. His focus turned back to the road in front of him in time to notice the distinct sky blue nose of a Crown Victoria protruding from the vegetation lining the median. It wouldn't be the first time he'd had a run-in with the local police department, and he was only too familiar with those cars. To prevent a catastrophic ticket, another bad mark on his driving record, he quickly downshifted and applied the brakes. With a slight chirp of the tires, he slowed to just 5 miles per hour over the speed limit in the nick of time. He looked back at his rival and friend as the gap between them began to close at a quick rate. Cooper noticed Wolf wasn't slowing as he moved to the left lane to make his victory pass. Knowing Wolf didn't need any more stressors in his life, Cooper did all he could to point out the police cruiser. He soon realized his warnings were going unseen as Wolf kept on speeding, his focus too narrow to care. "You fool, you couldn't say I didn't warn you," Cooper thought as he watched Wolf's brake lights glow and his tires smoke in what looked like a panicked deceleration. Yes, the police cruiser lit up with flashing red and blue lights and pulled out, maneuvering behind Wolf's car, signaling him to move to the shoulder. Cooper, now safe, took the next exit to the airport. He glanced at his large aviator watch as he pulled into the airport employee parking lot. He was on time, since his street racing session had ended with little cost to his normal commute. He pulled into his usual spot and stepped from the car, looking absolutely impeccable in his hand-tailored uniform. Catching the first employee shuttle bus he could find, he sat quietly with his flight bag and suitcase positioned neatly beside him. Since he'd been flying out of the Seattle airport for the better part of 6 years, he had his daily routine down to a science. Even if he had been off for the past month on vacation, still it was almost choreographed. He showed his identification, passed through the screening checkpoint, and headed for the coffee shop. He'd deal with his friend soon enough. For now it was back to work. Still, he had to admit that the race had been a good rush, taking away some of the boredom of the drive. He knew so dang well that he could do it while asleep. Now it was back to the real world. Chapter 8. The taxi pulled up in front of the Seattle-Tacoma terminal after a nauseating ride, swerving in and out of traffic and around single-minded travelers. Stormy Halifax tossed the driver his money. 2 hours worth of work gone and 20 minutes of wasted time on the commute, and leapt from the cab, running straight for the front entrance of the airport. She was all set to begin her average day with its monotonous routine. She was one of the baristas at a small latte shop, Republic Coffee, located in the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The small and quaint cafe was nestled in between the food court and a local gift shop. Stormy had been at her job for only a month, but it was such a hassle to get there that she wasn't sure she even wanted the job to last anymore. If only she didn't need the money so desperately. The airport was a bustling madhouse with an endless sea of people on what seemed to be a busy travel day. Republic Coffee stayed fairly busy throughout the day because it was near the top of the escalators and the main entranceway to a majority of the airline gates after security. As Stormy stepped off the escalator, she was immediately assailed by oblivious passengers, the smell of coffee, and the sound of a gate agent getting reamed by an unhappy customer. Yes, it would obviously be another long day of coffee drudgery. Pushy passengers and egotistical pilots. She could handle most of it, but the pilots were the absolute worst. When she first started working here, she'd found them fascinating. A great number of them were sexy, confident, and downright charming. It didn't hurt that they were well paid, flashing bulging wallets at the coffee house and flaunting expensive watches and sunglasses. By her third week, though, she'd discovered that most of the pilots made no secret about wanting one thing only. A lot of them had a different girlfriend in each city on their routes. She absolutely wanted no part of that. She'd rather be single than be some arrogant man's plaything. After she'd turned down several kind offers, they'd finally taken the hint and stopped asking her for dates or one-night stands. If she was being honest, yes, she'd had one of those, but that was in the past. Stormy had just signed into her register when a man in a clean, pressed button-up shirt, impeccably tailored even to the most stringent of military standards, walked into her field of vision. His gleaming gold pilot's wings adorned the left side of his broad chest, and above his right chest pocket, he wore a bright name badge with the words, Captain Armstrong, Trans-Pacific Airlines. This pilot stood about 6'4", with piercing green eyes. He wore a captain's hat embroidered with a gold leaf, and it had his airline insignia centered above the visor, peering out from the underside of the visor, and on the visible side of his temple was nearly black hair. Well trimmed and styled, his skin tone was slightly dark, perhaps a hint of a Mediterranean heritage. His face was clean-shaven, showcasing his incredibly sensual lips. His physique was a sight to behold, with broad shoulders, a muscular, well-defined chest and deltoids biceps, and triceps filling out his dress shirt. Stormy's eyes followed the natural progression of his impressive physique. dropping to the black belt fitted perfectly at his hips. Why did he look familiar? It wasn't until he was right in front of her that the connection clicked. Flashes of a moonlit beach, a hot, steamy shower, and even hotter kisses, large, strong hands tracing her body. Reaching for the missing necklace again, she fought the dizziness she suddenly felt. She knew this man, though he was someone she'd never thought she'd see again. And now she knew his name, or at least his last name. Her body trembled as she faced him. It had been years, 6 years to be exact. And he'd changed, but the instant ache between her thighs was a quick reminder that her body hadn't forgotten him. Closing her eyes for a moment, she allowed herself to remember that night. Remember every moment of it with him expertly caressing every inch of her, making her cry out over and over again. She'd done things with this man she'd never done before, and certainly hadn't done since. How did one follow up with another man after being with someone like Green Eyes? He'd been incredible, and she hadn't once felt the same reaction with another man. Her cheeks flaming, Stormy looked at Green Eyes and waited for recognition to light his eyes. But there was nothing there except a slight tilt to his head and definite interest in his expression. He had no clue who she was. Damn, she hadn't thought she was quite that forgettable, even if it had been 6 years earlier and she'd grown more curves and lost that youthful glow only a 20-year-old could have. Well, her hair was now its naturally dark brown color again too. Still, her ego took a nosedive. But did she really want him to know who she was? Would he expect a repeat performance? Would that be so bad? Questions with no answers flooded her mind as she stood there unable to speak. Did you hear me? Green Eyes asked. What? No. I'm sorry, Stormy replied. He must have placed an order with her. And she hadn't processed a single thing that had come out of his mouth. I want an Americano, 4 shots with room for cream. Her brain was still muddled, and she just stared at him blankly. Damn it. With all the blood rushing through her brain, she couldn't quite grasp what he was asking. I want an Americano with 4 shots and room for cream. He repeated very slowly now. I've been gone a while, but I would hope the servers here could still actually serve coffee. Yes, sorry, I'll get that right away. She turned and knocked down the container of half and half, cream spilling all over her leg and the floor. Silence echoed off the walls for several moments until he spoke again. Have a rough night, he asked with a laugh. She shuddered. She was really thrown off her game right now, and though it frustrated her, she was fighting tears. Excuse me. Come on, doll. I know women. And obviously you're having a rough day. Maybe not getting enough sleep. Maybe you should dump the man who's giving you those circles under your eyes. And let a real man make sure you're resting like a baby. He boldly told her, then added insult to injury when he winked. She was mortified to know she'd slept with this man. Even more mortified to realize she still couldn't regret it, even if he was acting like a typical alpha pilot who thought panties were automatically supposed to drop when he entered the room. Taking a deep breath, she decided she wasn't going to keep acting like an A-class klutz. And she was certainly going to stand up for herself, which wasn't something easy for her to do. I can't figure out if you're hitting on me or insulting me, but either way, your behavior is unacceptable. There. That was good, she convinced herself. Her anger partly stemmed from him not remembering her and partly because his attitude toward her was now ruining her one Cinderella moment in time. No, she hadn't escaped at the stroke of midnight, but she had run away, though he'd never come calling for her. Not that she wanted him to, she told herself. But still, she sort of liked living with the fantasy of a lover lost. He was no longer lost, damn it. I would never insult a beautiful woman, he told her as he leaned a little closer across the counter. However, I could give you a good night's rest. Stormy didn't know what to be more offended about, but she most certainly was horrified he would speak to her this way. Seriously, how could he not have even the smallest inkling of recognition? Best sex in his life? Apparently not. Her pride was wounded and she was hurt, which made her words sharper than she normally ever spoke. You will never give me anything, especially not at night. I don't go for coarse, primitive men like you, she said, a bit too loudly in her attempt at being stern, making several heads turn in their direction. I have standards. But right after snapping at him, her cheeks flushed. As she looked around the rapidly filling coffee house, This was hardly the place for private discussions. People were going to assume she was crazy and a man-hater. She just might be a little bit of both. He didn't seem offended. Well then, he drawled. I'm sorry, she mumbled. She was going to get into serious trouble if her boss came out from his office in the back. Don't worry about it, doll. But while you're standing there, maybe I could get my coffee. He was still leaning in way too close for her comfort, and her body was still reacting to his. With trembling fingers, she picked up the coffee cup and turned away, before speaking just loudly enough for him to hear. Obviously another pilot with an ego big enough to make up for a small package. Of course it was anything but small, but he didn't know that she knew that. Stormy. Stormy's shoulders hunched. Dang it. Of course her boss would choose the exact moment. She lost her cool to come and check on her. Now the wretched man would bust her for being less than her absolute best with a customer. But Green Eyes had deserved her wrath. If only her boss were a woman, this would be so much easier to explain. However, Henry hadn't liked her from day one. And now she was practically handing him a solid reason to fire her. The man had a high-pitched, nasal voice that was like nails on a chalkboard. Henry was known as Mr. Customer Service, and took any opportunity he could to insult the girls in front of the clientele. It was his petty form of vengeance, or so the theory went, for being turned down left and right by the opposite sex. Henry, I'm. Before Stormy could even finish, Henry interrupted. Captain Armstrong, I'm sorry about the delay, and about Ms. Halifax's behavior. This one is on us. No, everything is fine, Captain Armstrong said with a smile. Ms. Halifax is clearly having a rough morning, and maybe she just wasn't getting my sense of humor. As the man spoke to Henry, his eyes never left Stormy, as if to apologize for the entire scene he'd helped create. It didn't matter. Despite his clear remorse, she was still seething. Nevertheless, your coffee's on us, Henry said before turning to Stormy. Finish with the captain, and then immediately join me in my office. Stormy's heart sank to her stomach. Her day had just gone from bad to worse. She had zero doubt that she was about to get canned, and on the same day she'd received an eviction notice. What was next? Getting struck by a rare strike of Seattle lightning. As she began to come to terms with the gravity of her situation, images of living on the streets, or staying at a homeless shelter, began to circle in her mind. Jobs, even service jobs, didn't come easy, especially if you'd been fired from your last one. Hey, you okay? It took a moment to realize that the captain was speaking to her. But when she did, she gave the man a withering glare before deciding she'd best make this coffee a great one, since it was most likely her last one. Right. One quad-shot Americano coming right up. Stormy made quick work of making the coffee and handing it over the counter. I apologize for my behavior, she told him through gritted teeth. The pilot took a sip of his hot coffee before smiling. Thanks for the apology. You don't need to worry about it though. I can take it as good as I give it. Hope your day goes a little better than the way it's been so far. He tossed down a $100 bill as if it were petty cash, and then strode off to his gate. Stormy stood there motionless, as she watched the incredible backside of Captain Armstrong as he walked away. Damn, she wished he were short, fat, and ugly. Why was it that if a man was good-looking, it made you think he was actually a decent human being? It had to be the smile. No, it definitely had to be the eyes. Possibly the backside. Whatever the hell it was, she wanted to hate him. But she couldn't quite do that. For now, she could just feel anger. The man had insulted her, most likely gotten her fired, and he couldn't even apologize. He figured throwing out a ridiculous tip would make up for his rude behavior. Either that, or he wanted her to know he was rich, thinking he could buy a night with her. He would be wrong on both fronts. But there was an upside here. Being fired would mean that she wouldn't have to deal with him, or any of the other jackass men, who roamed the airport hallways thinking they were God's gift to women. The one thing that worried her the most, though, was the fact that she was still stupidly attracted to the man. How in the world could she find him attractive? What was wrong with her, that she found it acceptable to be attracted to the man, who couldn't be bothered to remember they'd slept together? Stormy had been loved and taken care of by incredible parents. She'd had a few hard knocks in life, but who the hell hadn't? She'd never been neglected or tortured. On the whole, Her life had been pretty damn great, actually. Enough reflection. Hardening her resolve to deal with her slimy boss, she squared her shoulders and forced herself to turn toward the office. Though her feet were dragging, she made her way inside and stood in the doorway. Henry made her wait while he scribbled for several moments in some notebook. Behind his pathetically small desk. It was a power move on his part. Not surprising, she thought. How much respect could the man have for himself? Working at a crap job with horrible wages despite his law degree from Harvard? Too bad the man had been caught concealing material evidence in a case and had been disbarred. He had wound up a manager in a small coffee shop, and he took his anger out on everyone. Are you trying to get us shut down, Stormy? She hadn't expected that. No, she said. Well, if you don't follow the rules, you get fined. And if you get fined enough, you get shut down. So again, what are your intentions while working here? To do my job and collect a paycheck, sir. Well, your job is to ensure that customers receive satisfaction. If we piss off the pilots, then we lose their business. Then we lose all the airline employees' business, and we get shut down. His voice rose the longer he spoke. I'm sorry I snapped at Captain Armstrong, but he was being rude as well, she pointed out. The customer is always right, he thundered. Deal with that. I apologize. I won't be rude again, she said, feeling tears behind her eyes. She hated that she sometimes cried when she was angry. She wanted to show she was furious, not a weakling, dang it. Look, Stormy, Captain Cooper Armstrong visits us many times during the week. You need to be more observant. Take the time to actually notice the crew members who stop in frequently, and be extra courteous to them. I know this is a new shift for you, but just look at their name tags, so you'll remember them more easily, and be sure to give them that employee discount. Follow my lead. I go out of my way to take note of every employee I see. Don't let these thick glasses confuse you into thinking I'm a blind man. Just as he was finishing what he was saying, he nearly tripped over his own desk. Stormy reluctantly nodded her head in agreement with her boss. Why make things worse? Is that all, sir? Using the word sir to address this guy tasted sour on her tongue. Yes. Now go man the register. The line is growing and Amy can't do it by herself. Stormy turned to walk out of the office. Stormy, remember. Stormy stopped, but barely kept herself from groaning, since she knew what he was going to say. Republic Coffee is happiness in a cup. Completely disgusted with this company droid, Stormy left the office. To return to work, though she did it with a sinking feeling in her heart. Upon her return to the floor of the coffee shop, she found herself in a daze as she wiped the tables and straightened up the boxes of tea and refilled condiments. So Captain Armstrong's first name was Cooper? She now knew the full name of the man she'd slept with 6 years ago. So much for him being green eyes. She was too frazzled to even think about it right now. Amy was working behind the counter preparing a passenger's coffee. Amy finished ringing up the passenger, then looked over at Stormy with a defeated look on her face. Why did you let that man get to you? Asked Amy when they were alone. I'm actually not sure, Stormy answered while playing back the conversation. It wasn't any worse than any other she had on a daily basis. I guess it's because I'm sick and tired of these pilots thinking they have a right to get into my pants, Stormy said with a wink, attempting to make light of the confrontation. Huh. Surprise, surprise, Captain Gorgeous is another full of himself womanizer. A Greek god of a man who sounds like a sexist, self-absorbed moron when he speaks, ruining all of that other stuff. You know, the hot part. If we could just silence him and tie him to a chair, we'd get a lot more female customers, and then not have to deal with all the guys who come in here, expecting a cup of coffee and a quickie on one of the tables. Amy spoke as she began steaming milk for the customer, whose order Stormy had just rung up on the register. It's not just what Armstrong was spouting. I'm used to all that, she stated as she got back to the conversation. It's just that I've met him before. I hear a story coming, Amy said with glee. No story. I was just surprised to see him, that's all. It's been a lot of years since the last time. I want to know what's going on, but I've learned in our short time together how close-lipped you can be. I'll wait it out, Amy said. Good, Stormy said. This week has all around sucked. I have to move on top of everything else. Don't you like your apartment? It's not that. It has new management, and they are remodeling. I've known that I'd have to vacate for a while. But time just crept up on me and now I have no time and nowhere to go. Stormy's brown eyes began to well up with tears. Again, she had to get a hold of herself. Oh my, Amy gasped, now staring at her with sympathy. Is there any way they can give you more time? Nope, she said as she carried a basket of dirty dishes into the kitchen. I've just come to realize that it is what it is. Amy shook her head. Thankfully, they were busy the rest of the afternoon. So Stormy didn't have much time to stress out over her living situation or her crappy job. That also meant that Amy didn't get a chance to ask any more questions. The reality was that Stormy had zero clue what she was going to do next. So how could she give any answers? Chapter 9. Stormy's bus pulled up near her apartment building after her seemingly never-ending day. She dragged herself from it, then walked to her place and made her way into the lobby. By the end of any day, her feet were trashed from standing for so many hours straight, so she normally took the elevator. But it was inevitable that fate continued working against her on a day as horrible as this. A large sign was taped to the metal doors, out of order. Stormy trudged up the stairs with her giant purse in tow. As she was about to reach her floor, she began digging for her keys. Good coordination skills weren't one of Stormy's strong points. At a tired mind, and in true fashion, the strap slipped from her shoulder. Half the contents of her purse spilled out. The sound of keys, makeup, and coins could be heard all the way to the bottom of the stairwell. Stormy dropped to her knees and began to sob. She'd had enough, and there was nothing that was going to hold it back. When she heard a door open, and then someone moving down the stairs toward her, she tried pulling herself together, but she was just too tired. She looked down, hoping whoever it was just passed on by. The last thing she wanted to do was talk about why she was sobbing in the middle of a stairwell. What's the matter, darling? Sherman asked, compassionately stopping next to her. The sound of his warm voice made her lean back against the wall. As she looked at him, trying desperately to still the tears, she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It can't be all that bad, he assured her as he patted her hand. I'm sorry, she said with a hiccup. Don't apologize, just tell me what's got you so upset, he said with the gentle smile she loved him for. She'd been blessed to meet this man at one of the worst times in her life. A couple months after she'd lost her father, Sherman had been kind and reminded her so much of her dad that she'd immediately latched onto him. Over the years, if too much time passed without seeing him, she had to go and seek him out. Then when she had lost her mother, Sherman had been the one to hold her. You're here late tonight, she finally said as she began to control her tears. He was picking up items near where she sat and putting them back in her purse, which made her want to break out into sobs again, but she somehow managed to hold them back. I ended up visiting too long with Miss Penny Little. Then the dang elevators broke again, so I had to talk myself into coming down all these stairs, he said with a chuckle. I'm sorry, I'll help you down them, she told him, glad to focus on him and not herself. He gazed at her fondly for a moment. This is why I appreciate you so much, young lady. Even though you're obviously having a bad day, you're still willing to help an old man out, he told her before shaking his head. I know how badly your feet hurt at the end of a day, so I won't be responsible for you walking any extra steps. Her heart warmed at his words. She wanted to be seen as a good person, as good as her parents had been, and she felt as if she were failing them every single day. She wasn't nearly as giving, as caring, as sacrificing as they'd been. So for a man she admired to tell her she was better than okay made her want to jump across the short distance between them and grab hold of him in a bear hug. She barely managed to refrain from doing just that. I like you, Sherman. You make me smile when I feel like crying. There shouldn't be anything in life that makes us sit and cry all alone, he told her while patting her shoulder. Instead of giving up and plopping down in this dingy stairwell, tell me what's wrong, and I'm sure we can find a solution. Stormy struggled with whether or not to share her woes with him. It really was her own fault for allowing things to get so out of control. But as he sat there with an encouraging smile on his lips, she decided she really did need a friend to complain to. When she was done, maybe she wouldn't feel like the world was coming to an end. I'm losing my apartment. My boss thinks I'm a horrible employee, and everyone I meet seems to hate me, especially disgustingly attractive pilots. Who could at least have the courtesy to remember my face? Sherman sat there quietly for a moment and Stormy wondered if maybe she'd offered up too much information. Most likely she had, but then again, it wasn't as if he was going to go around blasting her secrets to the world. In life there are always trials. We don't necessarily understand why they happen, but eventually we see there's a reason for them. Sometimes everything has to go wrong before it can turn around and start going right, he said before pausing and looking at the contents of her purse still trailing down the stairs. Then he turned back to her and continued speaking. It will work out for the best sooner than you think. As cliched as that might sound, it's true. And all you have to do is pick yourself up. I'll even loan you my cane if you'd like, Sherman said in his most gentle voice. You can never find that cane, she replied. Because then I'd have to admit I'm getting old. She smiled. She also realized that he was right. She would get nowhere sitting on the stairs crying. She needed to gather her fallen items, go to her apartment, and start making plans. Her mother had always told her a person chose to feel sorry for him or herself, and no matter how bad a day she might be having, she could guarantee someone somewhere else was having a worse day. There's always tomorrow, she finally said. I'm going to miss you, Sherman. You've always been so good to me. I really wouldn't worry about tomorrow yet, darling. Things are going to pan out for you. Just you wait. But for now, you need to go on inside, have a nice cup of hot tea, and get some needed rest. I'm not doing that until I walk you down, she insisted. I already told you, he began, but she cut him off. I have a purse full of contents to collect anyway, some of which are probably at the bottom of these stairs, she said with a genuine smile. He gave up the argument and took her arm as they stood and began descending. The amazing thing was that her feet stopped hurting as the two of them trekked back down several stories and toward the front door. You will not walk with me outside, Sherman insisted. Never once in my days alive have I allowed a lady to go back to her home unescorted. Stormy laughed for the first time that day and then leaned in and kissed his cheek. Okay, I'll concede to at least that. Sherman gave her a strong goodnight hug and then disappeared through the door. Stormy made her way slowly back up the stairs, walked into her apartment, and closed the door, latching the chain behind her. She decided to take Sherman's advice and let this horrible day go. Tomorrow had to be better. There was no possible way it could get worse. Sherman walked inside his house and picked up the phone. Impatiently, he stomped his foot as he waited for the call to be answered. Hey, Uncle. That's not a proper greeting, boy, Sherman told the young man. Sorry, Cooper replied, his chuckle clearly coming through the line. Hello, Cooper Armstrong speaking. How might I help you? His tone was almost serious. I'm too old to play around, Sherman scolded before changing his tone. Now the reason for the call. I need a favor. Chapter 10. The commute to work was making her late again. Of course her bus would get stopped behind a traffic accident, and she couldn't afford another bank account draining cab ride. But she wasn't nearly as stressed as the day before. Today, she was feeling a whole lot different about her predicament. After talking with Sherman, she was feeling more optimistic about life in general, and she was determined to face the unknown fate that awaited her, be it good or bad. Finally, the bus arrived at Seattle-Tacoma, and Stormy rushed through security and up to her job, out of breath as she looked around for her boss. His beady eyes were thankfully focused on something in his minuscule office. Good morning, Amy said, with far too much joy for any human who wasn't a morning person. How you feeling today? Better, Stormy answered while cracking a smile as she clocked in. The airport was alive with activity, like a frantic ant's nest. People were coming and going from all over the world as they strolled through the terminals. Stormy thought that learning about people and their adventures to and from exotic destinations made working at an airport coffee shop much more interesting. See, she could look at things either positively or negatively. At least by looking at her recent life in a positive light, she was in a much better mood. As she was making a fresh pot of house coffee, she was interrupted by the small bell on the counter. Good morning, Stormy said without turning. Since she was so accustomed to the sound of the bell, there was no hesitation in her response. When she finally spun, expecting to see another typical passenger, She stopped in her tracks at the reflection of Captain Armstrong in the polished brass of the espresso machine. Green eyes. Her nerve endings instantly began firing all at once as she felt the impeding confrontation. Without thinking, she darted in the direction of the back stockroom. Gosh dang it. All of that pep talk, and at the first sight of Captain Armstrong she'd panicked. Chicken. She continued to scold herself, even as he yelled after her. Does this mean you're not going to serve me today? Cooper called out. She didn't notice him leaning over the counter to get a glimpse of where she'd disappeared to. I'll be right there, Stormy stuttered as she rounded the corner farther away from him. What am I doing? And why can't I just face this man? He's an ass. But he's no different than many other men. I can face him without panicking, she thought to herself. As she wiped the sweat from her palms onto her apron, Stormy brushed her brown hair behind her ears as she composed herself. Quickly taking several deep breaths, she squared her shoulders and prepared to come back out. Come on, I have a plane to catch, Captain Armstrong called while ringing the bell. With one last deep breath, Stormy turned around and came back to the counter. She spoke as if nothing were wrong. What can I get you today? She said, while taking notice that Henry was out of his office chair and walking from his door to watch the transaction. I'd like my usual, please, and try not to force yourself to smile too much, Cooper said in a quiet tone with just the tiniest hint of tenderness. As he subtly smiled from the corner of his mouth, the slight impression of a dimple formed in his left cheek. While wondering if he was actually concerned about her, Stormy almost felt like sharing with the guy. Damn, it had to be the eyes, she guessed. They seemed to tell her to trust him, though from personal experience, she knew that wasn't the case. I haven't exactly been in the most smiling kind of moods, she said with a false laugh. Because of our little interaction a couple days ago, I might just lose my job. He stood there, his smile slowly dropping. For just the briefest of moments, she was shocked to see that he might actually feel the tiniest bit bad. She wasn't sure how that made her feel. It was too much, and it messed with her opinion of him. She didn't like it. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry, he said, looking at a loss. Don't try to be sympathetic, Captain Armstrong. It's not your style, she said. Then she squared her shoulders again and got back to business. I'm sorry, you said you wanted your usual? Was that with 4 shots? Yes, doll. Glad you remembered. She gritted her teeth, but she kept on making the drink, and then handed it to him. Look, Stormy, he began when an announcement came over the intercom. Captain Armstrong, please report to Gate A6. Captain Armstrong A6. He sighed as he looked at her. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, and then he closed it again, before giving her a look she couldn't quite interpret. I have to run, he finally said. He grabbed his coffee and took off as if the plane would start itself and leave without him if he didn't get there immediately. Stormy was left hanging at the coffee counter without the slightest clue of what Captain Armstrong had been about to say. As she shook the confusion away, Stormy's eyes caught Amy's, and it became apparent that Amy had been observing the awkward transaction between the two of them while stealthily peering from the back room. Stormy just shrugged her shoulders as if to say, what can I do? At least he hadn't been nearly as rude as he'd been during their last interaction. However, it was becoming increasingly insulting that he still had no clue who she was. Chapter 11. Trans-Pacific Flight 232 had just arrived at the gate after a 6-hour domestic flight from John F. Kennedy Airport to Seattle-Tacoma. The jetliner happened to be running a bit behind schedule, and Cooper's co-pilot had the gate agent page him. Captain Armstrong concluded that his life was always moving at Mach 10. As he sprinted through the terminal, having to adjust his hat from time to keep it on his head. It was a good thing that Cooper felt an intense need for speed at all times. It was why he still flew the jets. He didn't have to, was constantly told not to since he was the CEO of the airline, though his actual role wasn't something that too many people who worked for him knew about. He'd learned his lesson that night 6 years before when his father had passed. He didn't want to be the man flashing wads of cash and expensive toys when so many in the world struggled. Besides, by flashing so much money around, he seemed to attract the piranhas, who then only annoyed the hell out of him. Now, that didn't mean he didn't like his possessions. He liked them plenty, It just meant that he tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy once in a while. And flying gave him both satisfaction and the rush he looked forward to every time. He was responsible for a plane full of passengers. Their lives were in his hands. It didn't get more thrilling than being at 35,000 feet in the sky while going 500 knots per hour. Cooper almost plowed over a family pushing a double-wide stroller and decided he needed to get out of his own head before he crushed someone or tripped over a laptop cord. He wouldn't be flying anywhere with broken bones. He wasn't even late. Dang co-pilots in their panic. Oh well, it was probably wise that he'd left the coffee place when he did. Although Cooper could pilot some of the world's largest and most sophisticated airliners, he still couldn't comprehend the sometimes unfathomable complexities of a woman's mind. He said what he wanted, and that usually tended to be enough. And in Stormy's case, she seemed so familiar to him. He didn't know what it was, but he was drawn to her. Maybe it was because she was stunning, and it probably had something to do with the fact that she actually had a witty intellect. Something most of the attractive women he dated didn't have a clue about. He was getting real bored with airhead bimbos. Not that he'd admit that out loud. For some unknown reason, Cooper was determined to show Stormy he was a good guy the next time he saw her. She had to be thinking he was a real asshole by this point, which he somewhat deserved. He'd pushed about every button he could to see her fiery temper come to the forefront. She looked that much more stunning with her cheeks flushed and her eyes flashing fire. So he couldn't seem to help himself. As he approached his departure gate, he continued pondering Stormy. He just couldn't seem to comprehend how she was so oblivious to his charm. He knew he was a bit arrogant, but when women were constantly falling at his feet, it was a bit tough not to be. He'd never before had to take so much time to work a girl. Okay, seeing her twice might not seem like a lot of time to the average person, but normally it took him a total of 5 minutes to entice a lady. He smiled distractedly, stopping a passing traveler in her tracks. He didn't even notice. This was just the typical response he got from the opposite sex. Cooper figured Stormy had to either be younger than he thought she was, or just a prude. It was impossible to not like him. The thought was absurd. He could admit, though, that maybe his sarcasm wasn't charming her. He had unintentionally, of course, almost gotten her fired. Then he'd walked away, as if he didn't give a damn. That wasn't the best seduction technique he'd ever employed. He brushed off the last of his negative thoughts. It wasn't too late to rectify the situation. He'd just bombard her with his full arsenal of charm, and she'd be a goner within a day. 2 at most. One more visit, and she'd be panting at his feet. His smile grew as he arrived at his departure gate. He lifted the lanyard from under his suit jacket, displaying his airline ID card to the attending gate agent. "We've been waiting, sir," the woman stated in a harsh tone as she motioned for Captain Armstrong to proceed down the jetway. "Sorry, I'll be quick. Give me 3 minutes and you can start boarding," he responded, as he walked past her and down the tight hallway to begin prepping his aircraft for departure. Cooper rounded the corner and entered the galley with a new optimism in his step. He flung open the flight deck door and, to his surprise, saw Wolf sitting in the co-pilot's seat and going over the checklists. Wolf turned to look at who'd walked in. "Nice of you to join us," he sarcastically greeted Cooper before turning back to what he was doing. "I was buying coffee since I figured you were busy getting another speeding ticket." Cooper responded to his friend with equal sarcasm, always willing to poke a sleeping bear. "Yeah, not all that funny. That was a $300 car race that I can't afford right now." Cooper plopped himself in the captain's seat. "Oh, you big baby, I'll pay your ticket. Quit being a sore loser." "It's not the damn ticket. You know I can pay that without blinking. It's the mark on my record," Wolf grumbled. "Then be more aware," Cooper told him. Wolf's annoyance level with Cooper was now even more apparent. But then Wolf's expression turned from annoyance to a smirk. "I did beat you after all, so I suppose it would only be reasonable for you to pay the ticket and my car insurance for the next 2 years." Cooper shook his head while flipping a few switches on the overhead control panel. As the two shared a laugh, Cooper wished women could get over petty annoyances as easily as men did. Men didn't hold grudges and carry on for hours, having to talk about their feelings and why something happened. Hell, it was better left unsaid, in his humble opinion. He sat back and started buckling in, suddenly looking forward to a flight he'd done 1,000 times. He was really looking forward to his next round of coffee with a certain spunky barista. The flight began to board, and the flight crew focused on their typical pre-flight checks. A group of attendants was in the main cabin, busily guiding passengers to their proper seat assignments and assisting with carry-on bags. Meanwhile, on the flight deck, the sound of radio traffic and the hum of electronics combined with the chatty flight attendants and boarding passengers was almost deafening. The plane wasn't scheduled to return to New York, but was heading to El Paso, Texas, for a quick turnaround and would be back in Seattle by 9:30 that night. As Wolf began to read off the checklist, his voice grew fainter as Cooper became entwined in his own thoughts about the coffee woman again, which infuriated him. "Enough of this," he blurted out loud, completely out of context with what Wolf had been saying. The man was in the middle of conducting the first officer's pre-takeoff checklist, and Cooper was fully ignoring him. Wolf looked at him with confusion. "What, 35,000 isn't high enough?" Wolf asked in an alarmed voice. No, 35,000 is fine. Sorry, my mind was wandering." He reached into his pocket, and his fingers rubbed over the worn gold of the locket he carried with him every flight. It had been his good luck token for 6 years. Odd that he was reaching for it so much more often lately. "Hey, I'm looking for the flight manual," Wolf continued. "Oh, that's no problem. I have it right here in my flight bag." "Shit." Cooper paused. "I left my bag at the coffee shop. I have to go get it," he exclaimed as he quickly stumbled from his seat and out of the flight deck. "What about?" Wolf stopped mid-sentence as Armstrong had already left. He never did anything as foolish as losing his flight bag. This was the exact reason for him to quit obsessing about the damn brunette at the coffee shop. Now it was messing with his job,